Hello, this is Where I Think This Leaves Us, a retrospective on GRS LX 790, Advanced Topics in Morphophonology, and I'm Neil Myler. This video is for two kinds of people. One are students who just took LX 790 this spring, 2024, and people who didn't, but who may be interested in the materials. So the syllabus and the handouts are going to be freely downloadable via a Dropbox link in the description. Let's start by, for the benefit of both groups, reminding ourselves what we did. So this is a list of the titles of different weeks in the syllabus. What is morphophonology was the first one. 2, a theory of the architecture of the grammar and of its place in linguistic theory more broadly, which I'll talk about in a little bit. 3, a brief history of morphophonology. 4, a crash course in optimality theory. 5, cycles, boundaries, and derived environments. 6, emergent morphophonology, which was specifically about the book Emergent Phonology by Arcangeli and Polyblanc. We read the entire thing and talked about it. In week 7, we had student preliminary presentations on their projects. Week 8 was called Morpheme-Specific Phonology. Do we need it? In week 9, I gave my practice WOMP talk, which was on Latin noun declension, and a fragment of a grammar for Latin noun declension that I developed in Morphology of Syntax, which is theory that's been developed by Richard Kane and Chris Collins. Week 10 was called Morphomes and Paradigms. Do we need them? Week 11 was on paradigm gaps. What do we do about them? Week 12 was on blocking effects. Week 13 focused on my favorite talk at WOMP, which was Heather Newell's, on what she calls English PA morphology. PA short for past, but also passive participle and perfect participle. And then in week 14, we had student final project presentations, including a presentation by me on what I've been calling the big Spanish morphome, which we will return to. So that's what we did. Here's where it left us. So 1 or 2 people in the class hoped that I would put together some kind of overview of where I thought things stood, or at least my opinion on where things stood after everything that we've read and talked about. That is what this slideshow is about, and this is the contents of the rest of the slides. So the first part is going to be called the faculty of language in the broad sense, linguistic theory and grammatical theory. 2 is called the grammar and the grammar builder. 3 is called key questions and trade-offs in morphophonology. 4 gives you my current thoughts on morphomes, and 5 is called what's next. Let's talk through all these things. One of the major aims of the course was to help me and all the students in it get a sense of what the relevant questions in morphophonology, enduring ones and contemporary ones, are, and to map out the consequences of different choices, which the field as a whole is sort of entertaining. So we read a bunch of stuff by people from all sorts of different points of view on the questions. But throughout, I was always being honest about my own particular prejudices and opinions about what I thought was the most promising way of approaching each of these things. So the main aim of this is to give people a sense of where I landed on them, and where I think the main contours of the debates are. Excuse me. Right, so speaking of the faculty of language in the broad sense, people who took the class will remember from week 2 that I presented this diagram of how I thought the different components of what linguistic theory studies relate to each other. A couple of edits I would have made, I will make now to this diagram based on things that people said. One is renaming the thing that I was originally calling pragmatics broad sense as something else, so maybe interactional reasoner. The reason for this proposed change is that many things that are part of pragmatics, traditionally construed may belong in the grammar, in fact. So I'm thinking here in particular of cyclic calculation of implicatures and things of this nature, which Liz Koppek reminded me of as being something that's come out in the literature recently, and it's by having something called pragmatics broad sense, which is not part of the grammar. I might have been suggesting unintentionally that I rejected those approaches. So that's part of it. The other addition, the other change here is a direct linkage between the utterance planner and the grammar builder. So the grammar builder is roughly Chomsky's language acquisition device, or at least that part of it that is responsible for creating grammatical rules. The reason for this was evidence that Adi Editore, one of the students in the class, mentioned that very young children who were placed in the position of having to try to convey a message that they don't have or haven't seen the wherewithal for, have apparently, I've not read this literature myself, but they've apparently been shown to be able to create novel structures that they've never seen before, and which are not adult-like, but which they nevertheless put together somehow. And that suggests a way for the grammar to be updated in reaction to needs of expression directly, rather than having to come in via the parser. Everyone agrees that the parser has to be able to feed the grammar builder. But anyway, with those emendations, I still basically believe in this picture, right? And just to be clear here, and to remind people that were in the class, I don't think there's anything in this that's particularly original. I think this is just a spelled out version of something that Chomsky has clearly had in mind since the beginning, right? So I take everything in this diagram to be part of linguistics in the broad sense, right? The stuff that's enclosed in thick lines here, the grammar and the grammar builder, those are the subject matter of grammatical theory, right? Everything that's highlighted in yellow is the subject matter of social linguistics in the broad sense, and it's the combination of the two that makes linguistic theory, in my way of talking about things, right? So I reject any notion that we should say linguistic theory and mean just grammatical theory. I think social linguistics is theoretical as well, and it's part of linguistics and it's linguistic theory. So articulatory phonetics I take to be the responsibility of the utterance planner, which is the thing that takes what it knows from the grammar and uses it in combination with things from the interactional reasoner to build utterances. Acoustic phonetics is the responsibility of the parser. The grammar is a collection of modules in the super strict Fodorian sense, employed by Newell and Saylor 2023, which is one of the things we read during the semester. The different subfields of grammatical theory, so at least syntax or morphosyntax, semantics and phonology, and perhaps others, and morphophonology, if you want that to be separate, are concerned with different modules of grammar in this conception. The interactional reasoner is a central system in Fodor's terminology. So it integrates a bunch of different representational alphabets. So this is part of Fodor's view. A lot of contemporary discussions of Fodor's views in linguistics leave this out. But see page 103 of The Modularity of Mind, Jerry Fodor's 1983 book, for discussion of what central systems are. The remaining components, so the grammar builder, what I'm calling the social ledger, which is roughly equivalent to Lebov's social linguistic monitor. It's whatever part of your mind keeps track of things, both linguistic and non-linguistic, that pertain to categories of social group and other related things. Also, the utterance planner and the parser are limited in the sorts of input they accept by hypothesis. So they're not central systems in Fodor's sense, but they are not limited to just one sort of input either, apparently, which means that they are not modules by the lights of the version of Fodor's view that appears in, say, Newell and Saylor 2023. Now, it's worth saying that Fodor himself had a much less stringent standard in mind. So on page 37 of The Modularity of Mind, he says, one would thus expect, and I'm quoting here, one would thus expect that what anyhow seems to be desirable, that the notion of modularity ought to admit of degrees. The notion of modularity that I have in mind certainly does, end quote. So let's have a category of semi-modules for these remaining components. So a semi-module will be one which is not a strict module in the sense that it doesn't completely obey encapsulation or domain specificity. It can accept more than one type of input, but it's still restricted in its inputs in some interesting sense, right? So it's not a central system in Fodor's system of thought, right? So I think this is a correct picture of how the different subject matters of different parts of linguistics fit together. And if you're a grammatical theorist, as I am, then you're interested in the properties of grammars and the properties of grammar builders, which is whatever part of the language faculty it is allows us to build grammars, right? So let's spend a little bit longer on that distinction then between the grammar and the grammar builder. And I think this is a distinction which, as I say, and as you'll know probably, is one that goes back to the very earliest days of generative grammar and probably before that. I think that people tend to lose sight of it sometimes. And I think by insisting on being clear about which one we mean in a given case, we've made progress in understanding some of the issues that are at stake in morphophonology this semester, I think. You've got the grammar and the grammar builder. The grammar builder basically builds and updates the grammar. It's fed by, you can't see where this arrow goes, but it goes to the parser. And there's, by hypothesis now, another arrow that comes from the utterance planner as well. So basically, if the parser finds that it can't figure out from the grammar what to do with the entirety of an utterance, it will backheel that utterance to the grammar builder that will construct relevant grammatical material for the new item that is present. And likewise, presumably with the utterance planner, if you're trying to plan an utterance as a very young child and your grammar doesn't give you the wherewithal to do it yet, then that can be fed to the grammar builder that can react and build you a new rule or something, right? Let's talk about the internal structure of the grammar itself. This is the picture that I gave you in week 2 of the semester. So this is pretty transparently a version of distributed morphology. And it is essentially what I believed then. I think I'd still sign on to more or less everything that's here. It's a version of distributed morphology which tries to hold itself to the strictly modular idea. So what that means, for example, is that if there is a grammatical process, a grammatical operation, which has as its input a morphosyntactic feature bundle or tree structure, and also gives you back a morphosyntactic feature bundle or a tree structure, then two things are possible. Either that operation is part of syntax or that operation doesn't exist. Right? So this has big implications for things like impoverishment, for example. So given that impoverishment applies to a morphosyntactic feature bundle of some sort and then gives you something that's still a morphosyntactic feature bundle, that means, given the strict modularity postulate of domain specificity, right, having a proprietary alphabet, that means that impoverishment has to be a syntactic operation if it exists. And I believe it exists. So I'm committed to saying that it's part of the morphosyntax box here, right? Otherwise, though, this is pretty standard DM, right? So you've got the input to the morphosyntax, sometimes called list 1, a set of abstract pieces. These can be combined by merge, and you can have other syntactic operations applying to the result, giving you a hierarchical structure, which itself is simultaneously and independently the input to the semantic component on the one hand and the morphophonological component on the other. On the semantic side, which was not the topic of this class, You've got denotations of nodes inserted cyclically by rules of interpretation, also known as rules of allosomy, which are themselves put together by composition rules, giving you a semantics of the whole structure, which in the way that I'm used to doing things consists of truth conditional neo-Davidsonian event semantic type representations. On the morphophonology side, and it was this sort of like wing of the grammar, as it were, that was the focus of this class. You've got phonological underlying forms inserted cyclically by rules of exponents, otherwise known as vocabulary insertion rules in the DM literature. In my way of thinking, that is the input to a set of ordered phonological rules that give rise to your phonological surface forms. One thing that I mentioned when I first discussed this was that I thought that probably the phonological surface forms have to be the input to some kind of phonotactic filter. I think if you pressed me, I would probably say that I still believe that. But I'm less convinced now than I was at the beginning of the semester that this phonotactic filter has to be part of the grammar itself. There's a chance that you might be able to reformulate this as that is one's phonotactic knowledge might in fact be a property of the grammar builder in a way that I'll get back to. But this transparently is a realizational model of morphology. And it has that much in common with things like paradigm function morphology, Gregory Stump's framework, amorphous morphology, Stephen Anderson's book from 1992, and others like it. But it's unlike those in its syntacticist nature, right? So, sort of to put some more flesh on this, after I think it was in the sort of second half of the semester, I realized that the key questions that divide the realizational models of morphology are probably these ones. Assuming that you've chosen a realizational model of morphology, and I think you should, you've got to ask yourself three questions. The first is, are the things being exponed the things to which your rules of exponents apply, and you're guaranteed to have rules of exponents, because if you don't, then you're not a realizational model. Are those things that are being exponed, that appear in the structural descriptions of rules of exponents, A, hierarchical syntactic structures of some kind, or B, unstructured bags of features? Right, that's your first question. Second, if the things being exponed are hierarchical syntactic structures, what sort of structural unit is it that the rules of exponents pick out? Are they A, terminals, B, spans, C, phrases, or D, something else? Right? It has to be a syntactically defined object of some kind, given the nature of the architecture of the grammar, but which is it, right? That's another question. And then thirdly, are the rules of exponents A, sensitive only to information in the structure they are exponing, or are they also B, potentially sensitive to the way other structures are realized via transderivational principles that regulate surface correspondences? Now, the separateness of question 3 from questions 1 and 2 hasn't always been quite as apparent to me as it is now. But we saw during the semester, for example, that Donka Steriada, in her paper on the Latin T stem, right, believes that the things being exponed are hierarchical syntactic structures, right? But she still has a paradigm-based model because the realization of those structures is potentially sensitive to the realization of other structures, right? So the notion of paradigm has an actual primitive, not primitive, but it's part of grammar, as opposed to just being a post hoc collection of the grammar's products, right? So these really are separate questions. My preferred answers to them are the underlined ones. So obviously, I think that the things being exponed are hierarchical syntactic structures. The targets of the rules, I think I have set my face definitively against the idea that those might be phrases. What I vacillate a little bit on is the question of whether they're always terminals or whether they're in fact spans. So a span is a sequence of terminals. So a terminal is a trivial span. So B kind of subsumes A. And I've gone back and forth on that, as you know, and that's not completely resolved in my mind yet, I will say. As for question 3, I still believe in answer A. So I believe that rules of exponence are sensitive only to information in the structure they're exponing. And not B. So I'm still definitively against the notion of transderivational principles that would regulate how one competition happens based on how a completely different competition pertaining to a different type of structure would take place. And what that means is that I have no room in my system of ideas for the notion of paradigm as a grammatically relevant unit, right? So the best kinds of evidence that something like B, the answer 3B might be the necessary answer, the right answer, are things that really look like they require appeals to a notion of paradigm. So this has been the case in at least some tellings for the notion of paradigm gap, and also for the notion of morphome, which we'll get back to. For reasons that I'll say, I don't think that either of those things license the need to move to B. And I think the burden of proof lies with people that would want to go to B, because B is very clearly A, but with extra steps, right, with extra capacities. So if we can have a strictly generative model, we should try to have it, right, and not move to B unless forced. And I don't think the evidence forces B yet. So let's talk about the grammar builder, right? So this is roughly equivalent to Chomsky's language acquisition device. What the grammar builder does in the conception we ended up with is it constructs pieces. So a piece is the smallest unit to which merge can apply, right? So roughly equivalent to the terminal node, the non-complex, the simplex terminal node in the syntax. It constructs rules of exponence. It constructs rules of semantic interpretation. So it tells you that the meaning, it constructs rules, for example, that tells you that root 1, 2, 3 has the semantic interpretation lambda x doc of x or something, right? And there'll be a rule of exponence that tells you that that same root is realized with the underlying representation de or ge, right? And it constructs phonological rules. In doing this, it keeps track of statistical properties of all of these rule sets, right? So the morpheme structure conditions of earlier theory are constraints induced over the structural change part of the rules of exponence, right? Statistical regularities in the membership of inflectional classes, which are demonstrably active in work studies, have the same source. So this is going to be the origin of the sorts of effects demonstrated by Albright and Hayes, 2003, and in the sublexicon literature associated with Maria Guskova and her associates and students. Another thing that the grammar builder must be doing is keeping track of surface phonotactics. So this plays a crucial role in its ability to construct pieces and rules of exponence in the first place. That is, keeping track of phonotactics, we know plays an important role in the ability to segment the PLD into things that will correspond to terminals in the syntax or slightly larger units in the syntax, especially in early language acquisition. Now, given that the grammar builder has to do this, you might imagine removing the phonotactic filter from the grammar itself and having all phonotactic knowledge be represented in the grammar builder only. And its presence there presumably will be what stops the grammar builder from formulating rules that would, if they applied or added to the system, yield violations of surface phonotactic constraints. That's an idea that would allow you to, as I know that Charles Rice wants to, expunge phonotactics from grammar proper, right? Worth thinking about. I'm still not sure whether that will work out in the long run, but I think it's worth thinking about. All of this is compatible with the tolerance principle associated with Charles Yang's work. So the idea would be that the tolerance principle is what decides whether a given candidate rule being entertained by the grammar builder is entered into the grammar with an accompanying list in its conditioning environment. This is the normal case, the default case, right? Or without one. And in place of a list, some very, very general feature of some kind, right? Or no feature at all in an unconditional rule, right? That's when you get a productive rule, that when that second one happens. And this only happens when the version of the rule under consideration that has that property has a number of exceptions lower than the tolerance threshold, right? So in this way, this picture is compatible with the tolerance principle. One interesting feature of this way of being clear about the distinction between the grammar builder and the grammar itself is that the grammar builder emerges as the obvious seat of analogy. Analogy being a very, very old concept in morphological discussions, really as old as the field itself, actually. I mean, the ancient Greeks were arguing about the role of analogy in grammar. So now the status of analogy as a force in language change is not open to doubt. The extent to which it's an explanandum as well as an explanans, or instead of an explanans, is debatable. But regardless, that's diachrony, right? If we're on about synchrony, then it seems to me that the potential explanatory power of analogy within a synchronic grammar hinges on whether the theory imposes any interesting constraints on what the system can analogize from and what it can analogize to, right? In the system we ended up with, one can only analogize from the properties of existing rules or existing pieces to the properties of new rules or new pieces, or where new rule or piece is supposed to encompass not only completely new rules and pieces, but updated versions of old ones, right? Now, because it's new and or updated rules or pieces that are at issue, it's the grammar builder rather than the grammar itself, which must be the seat of analogical processes, right? So there's no analogy inside grammar. The grammar builder, though, sometimes does its job based on statistical regularities that it's observed in the existing rule system, right? Now, in this way of looking at things, you can't frame the debate over the status of grammatical facts as a matter of rules versus analogy. It's rules all the way down. Where analogy comes in is in the construction of new rules or the editing of old ones based on new evidence. We discussed paradigm gaps late in the semester. We read Albright 2009 and Gorman and Yang 2019 with respect to this. And we, in that discussion, speculated about how this picture could be extended to account for paradigm gaps. And the key appears to be to allow for situations where the grammar builder has constructed candidate updates to the rules of grammar, but has not yet reached the point of being able to confidently commit to any of them, right? So you leave open the possibility that the grammar builder can construct candidate rules, maybe enter them into the grammar with a question mark next to them. And then if it gets enough evidence and never if it resolves in favor of one of the two candidate updates or resolves in favor of stable variation amongst two or more of them, then all is well. But if that state of uncertainty persists forever, as it might if you're trying to decide whether a new root belongs on one list or another list of irregular type, then if that goes on forever, never resolves in favor of one of them, then the idea will be you get a gap, right? This seems to me like the most intuitively satisfying account for the fact that speakers, even non-linguists, seem to know what the possible fillers of the gap are. It's just that none of them sound right. I, for that reason, have always been suspicious of accounts of paradigm gaps that simply say, well, you needed to memorize a form here and you just failed to. That has to be part of the answer. Part of the answer has to be that you didn't get the right kind of evidence at the right time. And that accounts for the fact, as all accounts of this domain must, that paradigm gaps emerge in parts of paradigms where irregularity is found, right? But to say that that's all there is to it, that it's just that, you have no way of generating a form here, and so you needed to memorize one, but you never saw it, so you couldn't. That doesn't get at the fact that, and this has been reported by everybody that's worked on this, that even naive non-linguist participants in experiments, when asked to produce something where a gap is found, they'll usually be able to produce a bunch of candidates and be unable to choose between them. And this idea of sort of persistent uncertainty, where you have the rules, like candidate rules, but the grammar builder has not been able to commit to either of them. I think that's what you need to allow for to get that result explained. Now, that picture is compatible with more than one way of thinking about semi-irregulars. So in say, the Albright and Hayes type model, and also in the Gorman and Yang type model, semi-irregulars are dealt with via diacritics that trigger readjustment rules. This way of thinking about it is compatible with that. If you're trying to uphold strict sort of Fodor plus style modularity, then you have to forswear readjustment rules, because they have a nature that violates domain specificity. So their structural description and their structural change are phonological in nature, but their conditioning environment is morphosyntactic. Rules of that sort are illegal under strict modularity, but you can still have an account of paradigm gaps under this sort of scheme, because rules of exponence are rules of exponence are what insert phonological underlying forms. And so if you've been unable to assign a correct phonological underlying form because there are different candidate ones that you're entertaining, then those are candidate rules in the same sense in the system, right? So if your account of semi-irregulars involves special underlying phonological representations, which is roughly, actually not quite, but roughly what SBE has, and what, for example, Heather Newell's recent account of semi-irregulars in the English verb system has, you can have that sort of situation leading to a gap if there are several candidate rules of exponence, one of which assigns one underlying representation to the would-be piece, another of which assigns another, and both of them have question mark next to them, right? So you can get the same sort of, the account could run on that basis as well. Now, on the topic of emergence and innateness, of course, the grammar builder, and insofar as it has constraints on the sorts of rules it can build the grammar as well, is a natural point at which to ask about emergence and innateness. So early on in the semester, I introduced everybody to an argument which I've been calling the Pilichen/Fodor/Jackendorf argument, which I first came across in the work of Mark Hale and Charles Rice. And in the meantime, I've looked up some of these things. When I first read this argument, I found myself convinced by it immediately, and I wasn't expecting to be. And I presented it to everybody, and none of us managed to come up with a refutation of it in week 2 when I presented it, nor did anybody manage to do so during the whole rest of the semester. And it's a very important argument, which I think Hale and Rice are right to say has been unfairly ignored. So here is my short version of it. Premise A, learning anything from an input requires parsing that input. Premise B, parsing an input means representing its internal makeup. Premise C, representing the internal makeup of something in a categorical learning theory, so one where you're trying to learn categories which are symbols that you can perform computational operations on, right? If you're in a theory that's supposed to account for the learnability of something of that nature, then representing the internal makeup of something means assigning category labels to its parts, All right, that's premise C. Premise D, now imagine a learner, L, confronted by its first ever input of any kind. Premise E, by A through C, L must assign category labels to this input to learn from it. But by D, this is its first ever input. So the labels it uses cannot have been learned from any previous input. Conclusion F, therefore, the category labels it uses to parse its first input must be innate, and the labels it uses to parse subsequent inputs must either themselves be innate or derived by learning generalizations over the innate category labels. Now, assuming that this argument goes through, and again, I'm unaware of any refutations in the last 51 years, and none of us came up with one, despite trying very hard during the semester, it would do a lot to explain my attempts to show that grammar can emerge from stored acategorial exemplars somehow, have invariably failed, and they have invariably failed. Even the boosters say that they've failed invariably. Even the alleged successes in this domain always involve pre-wiring categorial symbolic notions like a unique identifier for each lexical item and one feature representation per segment in the target word into the model. So this is Goldrick and Cole's summary of Del et al. 1993. Attempts that have tried to get along without sneaking categoriality in via the back door have all been fruitless. And this is discussed at the bottom of page 11 and the top of page 12 of Goldrick and Cole 2023. So something must be innate. Doesn't have to be language specific necessarily, but something must be innate, right? And just for the sake of concreteness, here are the things that I currently think must be innate, or else derivable from much more abstract representational atoms, which are themselves innate. These are the basic operations of morphosyntax. So at least agree, merge, and impoverishment. The formats for rules and constraints of all kinds. The representational alphabets out of which pieces and rules are constructed. Features, in other words. The composition rules of formal semantics. And quite probably some specifics about morphosyntax semantics mappings. Probably the rules of semantic interpretation for functional heads. So, for example, the rules of allosmy that apply to voice or I star presumably have to be innate. The mappings, if something denotes an entity, then it is of category noun. And if something is of category verb, then it denotes an eventuality. Those might well be innate. Certain aspects of the Cinque hierarchy might be as well. Again, some of this stuff will be innate, but not in a language-specific way. Some of it will be language-specific. I'm not declaring anything about which I think these things are necessarily. I mean, some of them will have to be language-specific, I think. Clearly, like these mappings, for example, to the extent they exist, will have to be. But you can imagine merge and agree and impoverishment even being sort of feature manipulate, structure building and feature manipulating operations that might have analogs in other domains. You can imagine it. I don't know whether that's true, but you can imagine it, right? These things at least must be innate, I think. And here are the things that an acquirer must learn, in my current viewpoint. So the particular pieces in its language. So the pieces, those are the inputs of the syntax, remember, the smallest unit that merge can combine. The rules of interpretation associated with those pieces, well, the language-specific ones, that is. Remember, as I said on the previous slide, some of those have to be innate. The rules of exponents associated with those pieces, so the vocabulary insertion rules, everybody agrees that those are language-specific and have to be learned. And then the phonological rules and/or constraints of its language. I lean towards phonology being rule-based, as you know, and that's still true. On emergence and innateness again, the theory of emergent phonology described in Arcangeli and Pulley-Blank 2022 has a number of interesting properties, and those should be pursued by people interested in doing so. I think that deserves to be ventilated. But the account of acquisition in that book never comes to grips with the Pilishin, Fodor, Jackendorf argument. None of those people are cited in relevant parts, actually. And in the long run, I don't think that the theory will be able to get away with substantially less innate machinery than traditional generative theories. But nevertheless, the properties that it has are interesting, as I say. Things I like, or at least find interesting about emergent phonology, are its morph set relations and morph set conditions. This pair of things give them an interesting handle on the distinction between unproductive but represented generalizations and productive ones. They have rank constraints that choose among competing candidate outputs, but no universal markedness, no richness for the base, and no gen beyond morph compilation, which is just taking all of the attested surface forms of each morph and crossing them. Those are your candidate outputs, right? That means that they jettison my least favorite things about classical OT and retain my least favorite things about it. Another interesting property, of course, and it's sort of its flagship property, if you like, is the fact that it has no underlying representations. It just has these morph sets. This has at least two interesting, perhaps bad consequences, but they deserve to be investigated anyway. First is that there's no distinction between epenthesis and deletion at the level of the theory, right? So any phenomenon that might be analyzed as either one of those will be translated in this model as a morph set, which exhibits a vowel zero alternation, but there's no sense in which you can build any directionality into that at the level of the theory that I can see, right? Another interesting but perhaps bad consequence is the fact that morph set relations and morph set conditions, as well as many of the induced constraints, have to contain a mixture of phonological and morphosyntactic information in them to work as intended. And I suspect, I don't have a formal proof of this by any means, but I suspect that that will be true of any theory that does without underlying representations, right? So if you don't have underlying phonological representations, then part of the job that would be done by them will have to be filled in by having, that is, a sort of hybrid constraints that have phonological and morphosyntactic information at the same time. If I'm right about that, then an interesting meta-theoretical conclusion follows, which is that a commitment to strict modularity entails a commitment to underlying representations in phonology. And that's an interesting conclusion if true, right? Section 3 is about key questions and trade-offs in morphophonology. Here are some that we identified. One is the relative role and complexity and importance of rules and representations. So this famous quote from McCarthy, if the representations are right, then the rules will follow, is illustrative of one type of view on this, where you have quite complex and involved representations and constraints on the representations, and then the rule system itself becomes very simple. Compare that sort of view to SBE and its resurrection under the name of rational phonology that is being pursued by Charles Rice and Mark Hale and colleagues, where the representations are extremely simple. It's just sort of like timing slots with bags of features attached to them. And then the rule system has to do more of the heavy lifting, right? So this is a perennial trade-off where given I don't know that we really focus on this enough to tackle it head on. Where I sit right now is that I'll probably lean in the direction of having relatively simple representations and having the rule system pick up the slack, because that seems to be the fastest way of reducing, the clearest way of reducing the burden on the innate component. But it's very much up for grabs for me, this. Another trade-off is the status of not fully automatic alternations. So do we treat these as a special type of sort of hybrid rule, morphophonological rules, is the readjustment view, I guess. Pure morphology, which is treating them as no different from suppletion. So on that view, like sing versus sang has the same relationship as go versus went. Versus pure, albeit abstract phonology. The first option is a popular one, and it's the one that I believed in before I started taking strict modularity seriously. I might end up retreating to this in the long run, But it's one, at least empirically, it's one of the it's in the mix. I think the reason not to have it is conceptual only. The pure morphology view, I think, hasn't got a leg to stand on, because it's abundantly clear that the patterns that semi-irregulars and not fully automatic alternations generally exhibit have a life of their own. They're causally efficacious in the behavior of speakers, and that's missed entirely if you treat these things as suppletion. So the only things that have legs here are morphophonology on the one hand and pure phonology on the other. And if that's where we are, then you end up having to pursue pure phonology if you're trying to maintain modularity, and this is a point that I'll get back to. Another key question and trade-off is the relative importance of contrast and alternations as the focal point of phonological theory. So it's less obvious that contrast versus alternations has to be a trade-off than it is the case in the previous two slides, but in practice it often is a trade-off. And you can kind of see this from Halley's argument and the controversy that followed. If you do end up leaning in the direction of a purely phonological approach to morphologically restricted alternations, not fully automatic alternations, you, in my experience always, and perhaps this is inevitable actually, end up with underlying segmental inventories which contain things that play no role in maintaining contrasts. So just an illustration of this from late in the semester, on the right here is the surface vowel inventory of Spanish, which you can motivate through minimal pairs and actual contrasts, right? In pursuing a purely phonological analysis of a number of semi-irregular alternations in Spanish, I ended up with an underlying vowel system with additional vowels, which are highlighted here, not highlighted, but in capitals here, right? And this is an adaptation of an immediately post-SBE analysis of Spanish by James Harris. And you can see that why there's a trade-off here, right? So in order to account for these alternations, I was put into the position of having to add underlying vowels, which play no role in maintaining contrasts because they're always neutralized on the surface. So all of these capital vowels here get pronounced on the surface as either E, U, E, or A, or a diphthong, right? So it's in that sense as a trade-off. It occurred to me as I was making these slides that there might be another way out of this trade-off that invokes cophonologies. So I think there might be a way of building a cophonology type account, which would have a 5-vowel inventory underlyingly for Spanish, and then have cophonologies for to which different things would be subject. In one of those cophonologies, certain vowels diphthong guys when stressed, certain others lower when unstressed, and so on. And then there's another cophonology where those don't happen. That might allow you to eat one's cake and have it too. So the underlying representations in an analysis like that could contain only things motivated directly by contrast. So the underlying system could be just the same as the surface vowel system, 5-vowel system. And then the different alternation patterns would be dealt with by the phonology because they come from different phonological rule systems or constraint rankings, access at the point of spell out, depending on what's in the structure. And we convinced ourselves, with reference to Sandy et al. 2020, that there are ways of doing with this which respect strict modularity, because in no case do you end up doing anything other than transduction. So I haven't thought this all the way through, but it's worth considering. If I was inclined to think that phonology actively maintains contrast, which I'm not, then I would probably pursue this idea here. Other key questions: the proper treatment of juncture, so how morphosyntactic boundaries get reflected in the phonology, and the status of the notion of markedness and whether phonological grammars are to be characterized as enforcing it. On the proper treatment of juncture, I think the hopes for an account which doesn't violate strict modularity lie in the sort of work that manifests itself in the paper by Nancy Cooler from 2008 that we read, and also in Newell 2024, her WOMP talk that we discussed late in the semester. So this would be a system in which all juncture effects arise from the phonological structure of individual morphemes, right? And cyclicity, right? In an ideal world, those two things together will be enough to take care of all juncture effects, but we may not live in an ideal world. I've made my opposition to a universal notion of markedness that's internal to phonology as opposed to derivative of the tendencies of our parsers and utterance planners and motor planning. But this is a debate that continues, obviously. Now, I've mentioned modularity a bunch of times already, and the reason for that is that one's preferred options with respect to all of these questions and trade-offs will be strongly influenced, and in some cases dictated, by your commitments about modularity in the grammar. And the most restrictive hypothesis about this, which has a non-zero chance of being correct, would be that morphology, syntax, semantics, and phonology, or rather, sorry, morphosyntax, one box, semantics, one box, phonology, one box, are each modules in the terminology of Fodor 1983, and that moreover they obey the strictest interpretation of that term. Because this is more stringent than the notion of modularity that Fodor himself felt ready to commit to, as I already mentioned, I've been calling this Fodor plus modularity, so strict Fodor plus modularity. Strict Fodor plus modularity is the hypothesis that Newell and Saylor 2023 urged the field to pursue. And there's a compelling philosophy of science argument for giving it a hearing, I think, which is that if you think about it, the non-modular theories all predict sort of a superset of the type of interaction, the proper superset of the type of interactions that the strictly modular theory predicts, right? So if the more restrictive, strictly modular thesis were true, the only way for us to discover that would be to assume it and then try to prove it wrong. Whereas if we don't do that, we might never come to the by hypothesis correct conclusion that strict Fodor plus modularity is correct. So I think that's a good reason for giving it a hearing. It's a good reason for trying to construct analyses that adhere to it, without kidding ourselves that we know for a fact that that's how grammar actually works, right? So it's a hypothesis that's being tested, and the philosophy that I've just outlined says that you should pursue that one first because it's the most restrictive, and it has a chance of being right, right? An interesting consequence that we saw repeatedly was that if you simultaneously take morphophonological phenomena seriously, so that is, don't treat semi-irregulars and not fully automatic alternations as just suppletion, right? If you avoid doing that and you adhere to strict modularity, you end up with more abstract underlying representations than one otherwise tends to see these days. In some cases, coming close to the spirit of Chomsky and Halley 1968, never quite getting that far because you're under no illusions that storage space is in short supply. You're under no illusions that that you have to minimize the size of the underlying inventory. So because you're not under those pressures, you don't end up quite where SBE and the immediate aftermath of SBE ended up, but you do end up considerably more abstract than people tend to go in a lot of phonology work that you see knocking about these days. Now, I'm completely sanguine about that consequence. I have no trouble with that consequence whatsoever. But for some people, it will be unacceptable, right? And for some people, that will mean that they'll want to depart from strict modularity already because they're just not ready to swallow the sort of phonology that you end up with as a result of pursuing it. But that's at any rate the contours of the debate, right? Last two sections here, I'm going to talk about my current thoughts on morphomes and what's next. So my current thoughts on morphomes are, well, first of all, let's remember what morphomes are. So the term originates in Aronoff 1994, the way I find the most helpful of talking about them is to say that a morphome is a unit of form which simultaneously plays a crucial role in stating a morphological generalization, but does not correlate with a coherent meaning or morphosyntactic environment. Now, over the course of the semester, and in particular in the second sort of half of the semester, I came to the conclusion that there are two types of morphome in the literature, which I've chosen to name here the piece-based morphomes and the process-based morphomes. The second of these names in particular is imperfect, but that's what I came up with. So the piece-based morphomes are those cases where the morphomic pattern traces to a single position of exponents. So these are cases like the Latin T stem, the English past and passive participles, right? Those are piece-based morphomes. You can nail them down to a particular position that you can imagine sitting somewhere in a syntactic tree, right? These are to be distinguished from the process-based morphomes, where you can't trace the pattern to a single position of exponents, and you must instead state it processually in a sort of Frisianic style, where you start off with one thing, chop certain things off it, which don't need to correspond to anything that anybody would want to call a morpheme boundary, and then use that to compute some of the form, right? The piece-based morphome is not something I've ever been particularly scared of. The process-based morphome, of which what I was calling the big Spanish morphome, which is a special case of the pretérito y tiempos afines pita morphome in Martin Maiden's terminology. Those I am afraid of. Those I've always been afraid of because they, insofar as they exist and are real parts of synchronic grammars, not formulable within the sort of theory of morphology and of the architecture of the grammar that I believe in. My conclusions about each of these at the moment are that the piece-based morphomes are real, but they're unproblematic given the autonomy of morphosyntax, right? So if you believe in the autonomy of syntax, piece-based morphomes are automatically predicted to exist, and they do. Great. Process-based morphomes, I think, are spurious. What I think is that they're all the result of two or more separate independently motivated generalizations. So in the Spanish case, which I'll remind you of in a second, and perhaps in related Paita patterns as well, what you've got is an independent morphosyntactic generalization and a few phonological rules, all of which are motivated outside of the confines of the morphomic pattern. So none of them are ad hoc, right? But when they interact, they give rise to the exceptionlessness of the pattern, right? So here's the big Spanish morphome. Here is a statement of it, which is an adapted, augmented version of a statement from a pedagogical book of Spanish verb tables. The imperfect subjunctive and the future subjunctive are derived from the third person plural of the preterite, like this form here, quisieron, right? To form the imperfect subjunctive, you drop the ron of the third person plural preterite and add one of the two imperfect subjunctive markers, ra or se, and the person endings. The future subjunctive is formed by dropping the ron and adding re instead, followed by the person endings. So the blue here highlights where the morphomic pattern arises. In my quote-unquote final project, the handout for which is included amongst the other handouts in the Dropbox folder, I said that this is two generalizations. One is the generalization about the root allomorph, quis, in the case of this particular verb. This is the verb querer, which means to want, right? So that, I said, is conditioned by a morphosyntactic feature minus present, right? Which looks like it's counterindicated by the future and the imperfect, but the future and the conditional and the imperfect, that is, but the future and the conditional are built on the infinitive, and so that's why, and so minus pres ends up not being local to the root. which is why you don't get keys in the conditional or the future indicative. And then in the imperfect, you've got an impoverishment rule that impoverishes that particular feature, and so you don't get the keys there either, right? And importantly, that way of stating things gets you the fact that keys also appears in all of these other parts of the preterite, not just in the part that feeds the morpheme, right? Then the theme vowel allomorphy, the fact that you get yeah here and all through here, is produced by a few phonological rules, which in the crucial cases have the effect of causing the theme vowels to diphthong guys when stressed, when it precedes certain sequences of segments involving, including r, sir, and nt and nd, as it happens. So this is a phonological rule which is, I suggest, quite general, and that's why we also find it applying in forms that are outside the domain of the morpheme. So that's why we get queriendo, right? This is not part of the morpheme because you don't get quisiendo, right? But that yeah allomorph of the theme vowel has an existence beyond the morphomic pattern. And if you account for that, and you account for the fact that this special root allomorph has the distribution that it has, which goes beyond the morpheme, then putting those two together gets you the exceptionlessness of the apparent morphomic pattern, right? And there's no work for a explicit statement of the morpheme in the synchronic grammar to do, right? That was the idea. And hopefully that's going to generalize to some version of that strategy is going to generalize to every single process-based morpheme in literature. We're almost done. What's next? Well, for me, the following. I'm going to have a baby. We're having a baby in June or late May. So some of this will probably have to wait quite a while. But with respect to morphophonology, these things are what's next for me. So I'm going to distill something from my Latin declension project to send to Continua, which is a new journal on morphology and related things, Diamond Open Access. They're going to be publishing a sort of proceedings of WOMP. So I'm going to send, hopefully write something up and send it to that. I'm going to study more government phonology and rational phonology literature to decide which of these maths if either to name my colours to. I really need to figure out what I think about phonology proper. I have a bunch of sympathies and half-baked opinions, but I really need to bake those, and that's what that is in aid of. Once I've done that, I want to extend my work on Spanish verb conjugation, specifically by refining the account of the big morpheme that I just talked about, and by bringing in velar allomorphy, which is another sort of morphomic type pattern that's found in Spanish, as discussed by O'Neill 2015. There's also a paper by Nicola Lambertelli on Italian. That's going to be important inspiration, I think. And then beyond that, I want to see what purchase the accounts I've worked out for Spanish might have on other morphomic patterns identified for romance by Martin Maiden and colleagues. But that's what's next for me, hopefully. That's all for this. So hopefully that's satisfied the desire of students in the class to get to know where I think this leaves us. And hopefully for people that didn't take the class, it will serve as a nice advert to go in and look at the handouts which are available in the description. So thank you very much and goodbye.